Hello, welcome to the Professional Amateur, episode 6. In this episode, I'm going to do a presentation on the book of Ecclesiastes, which I'm entitling The Existential Crisis of Humankind. Oh, vanity of vanities. It's all vapor and dust in the wind. It's all meaningless. Life, just meaningless. Here I have a picture of the oldest known copy of Ecclesiastes. So this is Dead Sea Scroll number 4Q109, known as Kohelet, that's the Hebrew, translated in Greek, Ecclesiastes. And this was found in Cave 4 at Qumran. If you don't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're ancient Jewish religious manuscripts, the majority of which were written in Hebrew, on leather or papyrus. Many were also written in Aramaic, Greek, and Nabatean Aramaic. They were rolled up and stored in specific jars with tight-fitting covers, and when initially found, they were either scrolls or fragments of manuscripts or texts of previous completed scrolls. Some of them were torn into thousands of fragments. So I'll have a link in the show notes under the description to more detail on the Dead Sea Scrolls if you are interested. So I'm going to take I'm going to take a historical critical approach to sort of analyzing the book of Ecclesiastes, and then later I'll go into a little more of a literary comparative approach. So who wrote it? Who wrote this book? So here I have a picture of King Solomon, which I have the link attributed to where I got that picture from on Quora, but that's probably a more Middle Eastern view of King Solomon. King Solomon has been highly mythologized in European history. So a lot of the paintings and medieval paintings we have of King Solomon are very much Europeanized and Westernized, and this one may even be a little bit guilty of that, but it looks a little bit more like a Persian or like a Middle Eastern or ancient Middle Eastern king. So that's why I chose this picture in particular. So there's an allusion that in the book of Ecclesiastes that it was written by King Solomon. It doesn't say that outright, just alludes to it. But the book itself, the title of the book is Kohelet, which I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. If you speak Hebrew, forgive me. But Kohelet, which is translated as preacher or teacher, or really it's maybe one who assembles or assembler. So I'm going to read a quote from Julian Duncan's Old Testament commentary on Ecclesiastes, which was published in 2017. Ecclesiastes is taken from the ancient Greek translation of the book's Hebrew title Kohelet, a designation of the book's spokesperson. So though the origin of the Hebrew word is of some dispute, it is most commonly related to the word for assembly or congregation. So an interpretation also reflected in the ancient witnesses, thus suggesting the meaning is one who assembles. The specific form is a verbal noun, a grammatical form sometimes used as a professional title or to designate an office. So one may well ask just what role Kohelet designates, as the term is not attested elsewhere. So we don't have a history of this term being used anywhere else, so it's very difficult to determine. So hence interpreters, ancient and modern, have differed on whether it refers to Kohelet's function as one who convened the people to teach them, reflected in the traditional rendition of preacher, or to his collecting and arranging of proverbs and wisdom, which to me sounds a little bit more like an editor, maybe. Interestingly, the tribute of the epilogist, that's whoever wrote the end section of Ecclesiastes, at the end of the book is suggestive of both roles, remembering Kohelet as the one who taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs. And that's from Ecclesiastes 12, verse 9. So the NSRV translation teacher seems to be based on this reference to Kohelet's pedagogical activity, teaching activity. So I'm going to I like assembler. I'm going to use the word assembler. I think that sounds better to me, just me personally. So we don't really know who wrote it. Probably wasn't Solomon, but when was it written? So I'm going to read another stretch here of Julian Duncan's commentary because it gives us a good idea for the date. So it is seldom the case that the date of a biblical book can be established beyond doubt. The date of Ecclesiastes is also debated, but fortunately there is some evidence to help us establish a probable time frame, even if the precise period remains in dispute. So the Hebrew Ecclesiastes, both its vocabulary and grammatical forms, reflects a later stage in the development of the language. So a period sometime after the Babylonian exile, which would be from 597 to 538 BC, And in fact, the presence of Persian loanwords in the text indicates that it is most likely dated after the rise of the Persian Emperor Cyrus, who defeated Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. So on the other hand, a terminus antiquem, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, a date which means a date before which it must have been written, is established by the evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So fragments of the book in K4 date to the mid-2nd century BC. So this endmost boundary for composition is corroborated by the work of Sirach, and that's a late wisdom book that was composed around 180 BC. So that, because it reflects familiarity with the text of Ecclesiastes, that means Sirach references Ecclesiastes. And we know that was written somewhere around 180 BC, so we can probably assume these are contemporary texts. Or that Ecclesiastes is older than Sirach. So during the time frame in question, which I've got in bold, 538 BC to about 200 BC, Judah lives under Persian rule until 332, at which time the conquests of Alexander the Great end Persian dominance in the Middle East. So at this point, Greek cultural influence begins to assert itself in the region. So after Alexander's death in 323, Judah is under the control of the Ptolemaic Egyptian ruling family, until a series of wars in the mid-3rd to late 2nd century, during which Israel rotates between Ptolemaic and Seleucid rule. So it is sometime in this broad range of foreign domination that the book of Ecclesiastes is composed. So we don't know when it was written, but we know it's somewhere in these dates. There's an argument upon argument of whether it's Persian period or Hellenistic period. Could be any of those. We have no way to know that for certain. I'm going to have this as a link. It's an interactive timeline of Jewish history. It's really cool. So I don't have the interactive version here in my PowerPoint, but I'll have a link to the interactive version in the show notes. So somewhere around this period is when King Solomon ruled, at the end of the single kingdom of Israel. And then after he died, it split into the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So we know that he ruled sometime in this time frame, circa 1900 BC, somewhere in this time frame. And yet all evidence is that this text of Ecclesiastes was actually written either hundreds of years later in the Persian or the Greek period, somewhere in this time frame from 538 to 200 BC. So somewhere in this time frame here. So if all the evidence leads us to it being in this time frame, we can probably, can we answer the question, did Solomon write this? Probably not. But again, we'll never know for sure. We don't have any way to know. Could he have written something in older Hebrew text that was passed down and then rewritten? Maybe. Do we have any proof of that? Zero. So Solomon probably did not write this. So the book itself is controversial. So this is a quote from the Coogan and Chapman textbook, The Old Testament. Excellent book. Should get it. Ecclesiastes has been controversial since ancient times because it has unorthodox views. And early in the Common Era, rabbinical authorities disagreed about whether the book should be included in the Bible. So there were rabbis who didn't even want this book in the Bible. The book of Ecclesiastes presents itself as the ruminations of David's successor, Solomon, and this partially explains its acceptance as scripture, probably because it was attributed to Solomon, and Solomon is such a mythologized figure in especially Jewish history, but also in Christian history, that they wanted to keep. If this was written by Solomon, we got to keep it in here, and that partially explains its acceptance. But Solomon did not write it, or so the textbook states. We don't know that for sure. Probably not, but we can't know that for sure. And the book's views on the meaning of life, and especially on issues of divine justice, are at odds with the mainstream of biblical tradition. So here's a picture of rabbis debating, which was painted by C. Schleicher in 1860. It's the only picture I could find of rabbis debating. I was looking for an older time period one, but it's the only one I could find. So this book causes dispute because it's really depressing. And it questions retributive justice. It questions the fact that justice reigns and that in the end, good people get rewarded and bad people get punished. It questions this. So it's a book that is controversial in many aspects. At this point, I'm going to dive a little bit into a comparative literary analysis. But what I'm going to do first is read a couple sections of chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes just to give you a flavor. And of course, I think you should go read the whole book. It's a fantastic book. But just for the purposes of comparison, I'm going to give you a little flavor of it and then move on into comparing it to some other Middle Eastern literature. And this is from the NRSV version, the New Revised Standard Version. The words of the teacher, assembler, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, an allusion to Solomon. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It has already been. In the ages before us, the people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. Whew, depressing. And then in the end here, I'll skip over some of this. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. Whew. The more you know, the more sad it makes you. There's some truth to that. Very depressing. So here's another quote from the Coogan and Chapman textbook. Kohelet has been called a skeptic, a nihilist, an existentialist, a pessimist, and a realist. These and other labels show how difficult it is to categorize the content of this book. One thing is for sure, Kohelet is not an atheist. A believer, or at least a theist, he is not like a proverbial fool who says in his heart there is no God. For Koheleth, God exists, but human beings are unable to fathom the divine purpose. So this perspective is not unique to Koheleth. So here there's a quote from a Babylonian proverb, which provides a close parallel. The will of a God cannot be understood. The way of a God cannot be known. Anything of a God is impossible to find out. So also depressing. And then here I have a picture, since it's a quote from a Babylonian proverb, I have a picture of the tablet of Shamash, which is the Babylonian sun god. And the Babylonian king Nabu Apla Idina from 888 to 855 BC. So this is just a little bit of picture of Babylonian history to go along with the Babylonian proverb. So, yeah, I like the idea that the writer of Ecclesiastes is maybe the earliest existentialist ever. Even back then, I mean, that's very old. Even if it's 200 BC, we're talking about, that's quite early to have those kind of observations, almost existentialist crisis observations at that time period is unparalleled. But I'm sure other people had these thoughts. They just didn't write them down. And then what I'm going to do now is use Julianne Duncan's commentary. She does a really good job and compares Ecclesiastes to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So Julianne Duncan in her commentary sees Kohelet as a wise ruler engaging in a dialectic process of inquiry. So it's kind of an antithesis, synthesis argument. The assembler, who I'm calling Kohelet the assembler, values wisdom over folly, but he expresses total disillusionment that retributive justice does not always happen in real life observation. So from the text, the battle is not always to the swift. Sometimes the people who should lose win. And how can we explain that? And the people who should win lose. Sometimes the righteous are punished and the wicked are rewarded. What can we do? How do we take our belief in justice and in a righteous God, and the good guy gets his just rewards in the end and the evil guy gets punished? How do we take that belief, that desire, and enmesh that with the reality of the world in which that doesn't always happen? So she suggests that the Epic of Gilgamesh may have been ingrained in the memory of Kohelet. So here's a quote from her commentary. Scholars have long recognized specific textual parallels between the Gilgamesh epic and the Book of Ecclesiastes. However, the affinities between the two compositions are more substantive than 2 or 3 instances of shared phraseology. I suggest that the story of Gilgamesh is deeply etched in Kohelet's imagination. She gives some references here. So she's saying that Kohelet, the writer of Ecclesiastes, or the assembler, whoever it was, must have had the Epic of Gilgamesh deeply ingrained in his memory. And is there reason to believe this? I think there's reason to believe that the writer would be very familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we're only going to watch 2 minutes of this video about the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Hi, I'm Mike Rignetta. This is Crash Course Mythology, and today we're returning to one of the world's favorite texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one of the oldest written stories in the world, and it's a great illustration of Joseph Campbell's monomythic hero's journey introduced last episode. Plus, it has sacred trees, love-struck goddesses, and a fearsome demon named Humbaba. To Sumeria. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than 4,000 years old. Written versions of the story date back to 2100 BCE, which gives it incredible historical value. For instance, several versions of the Gilgamesh story use both Sumerian and Akkadian names for gods, which shows how the story might have passed orally between the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia. This could also be considered syncretism, when 2 religious traditions combine over time. In this episode, we're going to work from a version of the epic written around 1200 BCE and see how Gilgamesh himself fits into the hero's journey. A fair bit of warning though, in this story there is a brief mention of rape. At the start of our tale, Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and he's both a bad guy and a bad king. His subjects are unhappy, he disrespects the gods, and he's a serial rapist. So basically, he's the opposite of a hero. But Gilgamesh, like many heroes, has divine parentage, a goddess mom and a human king dad. Somehow this makes him 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Try not to think too hard about the math on that one, but either way, he's still mortal, and that's hard for him to accept. Eventually, Gilgamesh has a number of crazy adventures. He chops down some famous trees and meets his best friend Enkidu, who helps Gilgamesh become a better man and a better king. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh goes to the underworld to try to bring him back. He fails, however, and then must admit that he's human after all. In the end, Gilgamesh is considered a hero, not just for his incredible deeds, but for coming to understand and accept his true nature. But okay,
I'm going to stop there. If you want to watch the rest of this, which I recommend, I'll have it in the show notes under the description, a link to this video about more detail on the Epic of Gilgamesh. But he's put it better than I could have ever put it, so I just want to do a quick summation of what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. And it's this, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So Gilgamesh quests incessantly in order to try to conquer mortality, to fight the finite existence of humanity, to fight and conquer death itself. And here I've got a picture from a cylinder seal impression of Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu killing the bull of heaven. So this story it's a universal epic that would have been well known during the time period, especially in the Middle East. So it's not a stretch to say that the writer or the compiler or editor of Ecclesiastes would have been familiar with it. All of them, whoever was involved in that, was literate at the time, would have been familiar, would have heard the story, would have very likely been familiar with the themes of this story, as it's a seminal work in human history, especially in ancient Middle Eastern history. So I don't think it's a big stretch. I don't think Julian Duncan's ideas of the themes being similar are a stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to the two parallels that I found. So Siduru, who is she's the tavern keeper in the underworld. At the end of the book, who kind of sums things up for Gilgamesh. She was pro wine, pro feasting, pro music, pro dancing, pro joy, pro sex, and pro family. And this is actually a book. I got this picture from a book that Peter Dyer wrote. So if you're interested in that, I'll have a link to that too. But I wanted to have a picture of Siduru because this is what Siduru was telling Gilgamesh at the end of the epic. And this is a quote from Julian Duncan's commentary. When the gods made humans, they kept one destiny for themselves and assigned humans another. Her ensuing call to Gilgamesh, to feast, to celebrate, to love with affection and passion, becomes in effect an amplification on mortal status. It is a description of what is properly the human domain. Gilgamesh has wished to transcend his mortal nature. In response, Siduru assures him he cannot. But she points out those other things that also belong to that status, that mortal status, in seeking to avoid death, the defining mark of his humanity, Gilgamesh also missed out on those goods that are a constituent part of humanness. It is noteworthy that before Siduru offers Gilgamesh a modus vivendi, or a mode of living or a way of life, is what that means in the Greek, literally, or in Latin, sorry. Modus means mode or way, and or method or manner, and vivendi means of living. She asserts the certainty of death for every human. Implicit in this sequencing is a recognition that before Gilgamesh may re-enter life, he must come to terms with the inevitability of death. And that is a universal theme. I'm going to read that one more time. In order to re-enter life, we must come to terms with the inevitability of death. So Gilgamesh must accept death before he can begin to live. Drawing masterfully from the ancient lore surrounding this mighty warrior legend, the author of this tale, and I think she's referring to Ecclesiastes, has composed a kind of anti-epic. The heroic postures by which people seek to thwart death are exposed as illusory. The story asserts the very real limitation of death on human existence, but at the same time affirms the sweetness of the goods and blessings that are part and parcel of that finite existence. So as we will see, the thought of Kohelet, the writer or the assembler of Ecclesiastes, is imbued with such themes. So I agree. I think she makes a good point. And to hammer that point home, I'm going to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 15. So I commend enjoyment, for there is nothing better for people under the sun than to eat and drink and enjoy themselves. For this will go with them in their toil through the days of life that God gives them under the sun. And I think this is the reason that this is one of the reasons why this book is so controversial in the biblical canon. This seems like a call to hedonism. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. This is certainly a good way to justify, merrymaking and all kinds of other raucous partying and things like that. I don't so much see it as an invitation towards wanton lasciviousness. I see it more as a call to enjoy the things that are good and perhaps not focus so much on the things that are bad. Almost as if, through the lamenting of a wise man who's been a leader, who's seen the ills and the evils of the world, we can still make merry, enjoy ourselves, enjoy our youth and our humanity during this finite time, and give honor and deference to God at the same time, and not be, I don't think this is a call towards hedonism. Now, that was a caution and a warning for, I think, the rabbis who wanted to include this in the canon, and the ones who didn't. They probably were worried that this would be a call to hedonism. So take it for what it is. I think that there's balance in that, but I like the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis of it. Yes, justice is good, but even even in pursuing justice, even in pursuing wisdom and righteousness, you'll see that sometimes the fools win and the wise people lose. That there's chance, that there's time and chance involved, and these are beyond comprehension. It's a mystery. It's a mystery, and and there's reservation in that. But then at the end, you still prefer wisdom over folly. So Kohelet still says wisdom is better than folly. However, the battle doesn't always go to the one who's prepared. Sometimes chance intervenes, and things happen that you can't foresee. And that's life. That's part of our finite existence and part of our finite capacity for knowledge and foreknowledge as well. It's part of being human. And this is why this is one of my favorite books in the biblical canon. And then at the very end, what I would like to do is talk about the cyclical nature of life, the cyclical nature of humanity, and what I think is another observation of Ecclesiastes that really stands out to me, and that's that there's nothing new under the sun. Everything repeats itself. It's just cycles upon cycles. Generations come and go, empires rise and fall, humans live and die and continue on to do so. And I really saw a huge parallel between Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire paintings and this part of Ecclesiastes that I read about there's nothing new under the sun. What has been, what we call new, it's already happened before. We've repeated ourselves over and over again, and you only have to look back through history to find the parallels. And there's the old adage, history repeats itself, and for those who don't study history, they're doomed to repeat it. I agree with that saying. I think that's something that is highlighted in Ecclesiastes as well. So in Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire paintings, it's a series of 5 paintings created by Thomas Cole in the years 1833 to 1836. And it's notable in part for reflecting popular American sentiments of the times of the early 1800s, when many saw pastoralism and agrarian living as the ideal phase of human civilization. And people really feared that empire would lead to gluttony and inevitable decay. And the theme of cycles is one that Cole returned to frequently in his other work as well. And I'll have a link in the show notes to more detailed descriptions of each one of these paintings. But I just wanted to go over each one really quickly here at the end of my presentation. So this one here is the savage state. Everything's raw, nature, power, storms, mountains. No humans there. And then the second picture in the series is the pastoral or the Akkadian state. You have like one human shepherding a herd of animals, a little settlement in the background, but still this grandeur, this nature, this connection with nature that still exists, this beauty. And then you have the consummation of empire. So we've grown into a huge empire like the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, beautiful, ornate statues, commerce, huge pantheons and pillars, just gorgeous, the height of civilization. And destruction is next. Then we come into destruction, and here we have the city's on fire. It's burning down. The head has been ripped off of the statues. People are fleeing in the streets, falling, trying to flee over the bridge from what seems like an invading army. This is the repetition of history. And, Cole notes that in this, all empires that rise fall. There is not one empire that has survived the test of history. Not one. And they all thought they were going to. And they all thought this time is different. And they all thought we will last forever. But then reading even back from biblical history all the way through till today, our Western scientific empire that we've built, it too is fading. And it's not going to last forever either. And then here we have desolation. So after the civilization falls and nature starting to grow back in and overtake the ghosts of civilization. And I find these paintings beautiful and also very reminiscent of the cycles of life and the woe of Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun. We just keep repeating history. And I think we're here, I think we're here in the height of empire picture, in my personal conviction. We're here at the height of empire. You know, we have all these things. We've got civilization, we have space travel, we have high society and all of these things. And we're reveling in it, and yet, you know, this will not last, you know, this won't. No empire has survived the test of history. You know, the British Empire rose and fell in the last century, and I think the Pax Americana, the American Empire, you know, is rose in the post-World War II order. And what we're seeing in time and history now is the shaking of the foundations of the post-World War II order. And we don't know what comes next. Nobody knows what comes next. That's why this era is so full of uncertainty. But there's nothing new here. You know, we can look to the past and see how empires fell in the past, and see how our empire too will fail. And not to be depressing, but you know, that's life. That's the cycles of history. That's the nature of human finiteness of existence. We build empires and they crumble. Why? Why? What's the point? And to me, the call of Ecclesiastes is really answered in the teachings of Jesus, which is, you know, why pile up your treasures on earth when you're only going to die and lose it all? Why try to gain the whole world and material wealth just to lose your soul to it? And then the writer, the Kohelet, reminisces on this. Why pile up all these riches just to see it go to a spoiled young ruler who inherits it? Why? What's the point of all this? My goodness. And the point is, eat, drink, be merry, enjoy the present moment, enjoy the life you have. Don't put all your treasures on earth. You know, put them in heaven. Look, enjoy the time you have, enjoy the present moment, but don't stack up all your treasures here on earth, because this place is passing away, and it will be renewed, but it will pass away, and that's the cycles of life. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. I will have all of these, all the different slides. I'll have links in the show notes so that you can go and dig in more detail if you want to. Appreciate it, and I'll see you on the next episode.